A woman walks out of the stone gate of a Galilean village called Nain, trailing behind a wooden plank. She is not crying quietly. A wealthy synagogue leader watches his 12-year-old daughter open her eyes. A brother walks out of a dark cave, still bound tightly in grave clothes. Tired man from his sleep in a sinking boat requires the exact same amount of divine effort as pulling a dead man out of a stone tomb. Zero effort, no sweat, no pacing, just a word. But to see how terrifying this quiet authority actually feels in real time, who have to follow him into a house where the professional mourners have already started playing the funeral flutes. The flutes are already wailing in the courtyard. Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue, a man who wears his authority in the heavy fringes of his garments, has fallen entirely to pieces. His 12-year-old daughter is gone. The professional mourners have already taken over his home in Capernaum. They are tearing their clothes. They are throwing dust into the heavy, stagnant afternoon air. The timeline has run out. Jesus walks through the chaos and says something that makes the weeping crowd instantly burst into mocking laughter. The child is not dead, but sleeping. They laugh because they know what a corpse looks like. They know the permanent, ashen color of a body that has ceased to breathe. But they do not know what a gyro looks like in the mouth of the man standing in their courtyard. Jesus does not argue with the crowd. He simply clears the room. He forces the noise, the mourners, and the mockery out the door, smelling of a 4-day decay. Same impossibility, again and again. Most people assume these stories are just random displays of divine power. He takes only the mother, the father, and 3 fishermen into the quiet chamber. The air inside is completely still. The girl lies on the bed, pale, cold, and motionless. Remember the prophets of the Old Testament. Remember Elijah stretching his body over the widow's boy, sweating, crying out to the heavens. Remember Elisha pacing the stone floor in sheer exhaustion, fighting a spiritual war for a single heartbeat. Jesus does not pace. Jesus does not sweat. He walks to the side of the bed. He reaches down and takes her cold, rigid hand into his own warm fingers, and then he speaks 2 words in Aramaic. Talitha Kumi, little girl, get up. He speaks to her with the exact same tone a mother uses, to wake a sleeping child when the morning sun hits the window. This is not a desperate theological battle. It is a morning routine, instantly. The blood rushes back into her veins. The lungs pull in the air. The 12-year-old girl opens her eyes, stands up, and begins walking around the stone room. And in a detail that proves the absolute, calm mastery of the moment, Jesus turns to her paralyzed parents and tells them to get her something to eat. He is not exhausted by the miracle. He is just concerned she might be hungry. We tend to read them as scattered magic tricks, a handful of isolated proofs that God is stronger than death, meant to offer us a vague sense of comfort. Death is terrified of him, but he is completely unimpressed by death. A hand reaches out. A word is spoken. The grave is robbed. But stealing a 12-year-old girl back from the threshold of death, just moments after her heart stops beating, is one thing. It is a staggering trespass. But the body is still fresh. The real test of this authority requires a different kind of tomb. What happens when the enemy is not given an hour to claim its prize, but given 4 uninterrupted days in the dark? But the detail that changes everything about the greatest resurrection in the Gospels is a deliberate, agonizing delay. Read John, chapter 11. The messenger arrives from Bethany with frantic news. The one you love is sick. Jesus is about a day's journey away, across the Jordan River. If he leaves immediately, he can arrive before the end. If he speaks the word from where he stands, he can heal the man from a distance, just as he did for a centurion's servant. He does neither. He intentionally stays exactly where he is for 2 more days. By the time he finally walks up the rocky road into the village of Bethany, his friend Lazarus has been in a sealed tomb for 4 days. Bethany is only 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. This is not a private, quiet tragedy in a rural Galilean outpost. When we face the grave ourselves, We treat them like theological flexes that simply validate whoever happens to be performing them. A massive crowd of professional mourners, skeptical religious leaders, and grieving family members has gathered. They have been sitting in the dust. The weeping is loud, public, and inescapable. Why 4 days? To a modern reader, 4 days just means Jesus was too late. But in first-century Judaism, 4 days meant something incredibly specific. You can find the context recorded in ancient rabbinic literature, scattered across commentaries like Genesis Rabbah and Leviticus Rabbah. In the ancient Jewish understanding of the afterlife, the soul was believed to hover over the deceased body for 3 days, waiting and hoping for a chance to re-enter. The spirit lingered near the flesh, but on the 4th day, the biological reality set in. The color of the face drastically changed. The body began to bloat and rupture in the sweltering Judean heat. Once the physical corruption began, the soul permanently abandoned the corpse. Day 1, Day 2, and Day 3 meant death, but perhaps an agonizingly slim margin for a miracle. Day 4 meant absolute, irreversible, decay. When Martha meets Jesus on the road, she is completely shattered. When he walks to the burial cave and tells the men to roll the heavy limestone disc away from the entrance, she recoils. She gives him a stark, grotesque biological warning. Lord. By this time, there is a bad odor. But if you look closely at the original texts, and if you trace the specific details of every single recorded resurrection in the Bible, for he has been there 4 days, she knows what happens to human tissue in the dark. The 4 days were not a scheduling failure. They were a theological ambush. Jesus waits until the rabbinic hope of resuscitation is mathematically and doctrinally impossible. He waits until the spirit has supposedly abandoned the scene forever. He waits until the stench of decomposing flesh is so thick it cannot be ignored by anyone in the crowd. He is forcing a confrontation that goes far beyond waking up a freshly deceased 12-year-old girl. He is stepping up to a corpse that has already begun to dissolve. He is drawing a line in the sand against the chemical breakdown of human cells, and then he opens his mouth. Jesus stands before the black mouth of the cave. The heavy limestone disc grinds against the earth. The stench of rot hits the midday air. The crowd shrinks back. The professional mourners cover their faces. Jesus does not. He does not whisper. He does not pace the stone floor. He does not stretch himself out over the cold rock. He shouts into the dark, "Lazarus, come out." Deep inside the cavern, a stopped heart violently contracts. Coagulated blood forces its way through dried veins. Lungs expand and pull in the damp air. A shadow moves in the gloom. You start to see a blueprint that the random miracle reading completely misses. These events are not medical resuscitations. They are divine trespassing. A figure appears at the entrance of the tomb. He shuffles toward the blinding Judean sun. His hands and feet are tightly bound in strips of linen. His face is entirely wrapped in a burial cloth. Jesus looks at the terrified, paralyzed crowd. Unbind him and let him go. It is the absolute climax of his earthly miracles. But pay close attention to the fabric. Pay attention to the physical mechanics of how Lazarus leaves the grave. He is completely tangled in his own burial clothes. He cannot free himself. He cannot take a full step. He needs the living to rip the linen away so he can breathe properly. Lazarus is not a resurrected man. He is a resuscitated corpse. He is awake, but he is still under the exact same biological curse. His cells will eventually fail again. He will grow old. His heart will stop a second time. His sisters will have to mourn him all over again. Every single person brought back to life in the biblical record before Easter morning shares this brutal reality. The widow's son had to die twice. The Shunammite's boy had to die twice. Jairus' daughter had to die twice. They were hostages temporarily released from the grave, but their ransom was never paid. They brought their mortality back with them. They are calculated. Escalating invasions into an enemy's territory. They are not just about bringing a heartbeat back to a cold chest. Now, fast forward just a few weeks. Another limestone tomb. Another heavy stone rolled away. It is Sunday morning in a garden outside Jerusalem. Peter and John sprint into the open cave and stop dead in their tracks. There is no stench of rot. There is no shuffling man needing help. Look at the specific detail John records in his gospel. He writes that the linen strips are lying on the cold rock. The cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head is not cast aside in a frantic, messy pile. It is folded up by itself, resting completely separate. No one had to unbind him. No one had to untangle his arms and legs. His body did not just wake up. It passed directly through the linen wrappings, leaving them collapsed on the stone exactly where they lay. But that folded piece of fabric introduces a theological and biological anomaly that changes the entire trajectory of the human race. The collapsed linen in the empty tomb is not just an organizational detail left for Peter to find. It is the birth certificate of an entirely new physical reality. When we talk about Easter, we often lump the resurrection of Jesus into the same category as the stories of Jairus' daughter or the widow's son. They are a coordinated sequence of strikes leading up to a very specific Sunday morning in a Jerusalem garden. To feel the true weight of what happens, we treat it as just the biggest, most impressive version of the same miracle. But read the letters of the New Testament. The writers insist on a massive, unbridgeable distinction between what happened to Lazarus and what happened on Sunday morning. Think about the psychological reality of being Lazarus. He was pulled out of the dark. He embraced his weeping sisters, and he breathed the fresh air of Bethany. But every time he developed a cough, every time he felt a sharp pain in his chest, he knew the truth. The grave was still waiting for him. He had to go through the terror of dying all over again. Jesus did not come back to an old body with an impending expiration date. Easter is not a return to the old life. It is the inauguration of an indestructible one. Jesus steps out of the tomb with a physical body, but the physics governing that body have been entirely rewritten. Look at how he interacts with the material world over the next 40 days. He is not a phantom. He is not a floating spirit. He eats broiled fish over a smoking charcoal fire by the Sea of Galilee. You can hear the gravel crunch beneath his sandals. The disciple Thomas is invited to press a physical hand into the violently torn flesh of his side. He is heavy, concrete, and undeniably real. When the stone rolls away for Jesus of Nazareth, you have to look at the people who were pulled out of the dark before him. And yet, this same body walks straight through the heavy timber of locked doors in Jerusalem. This same body passes completely through linen burial wrappings without even disturbing their shape. Death no longer has any jurisdiction over his biology. He cannot be killed. He cannot grow sick. The Apostle Paul calls this the first fruits. It is an ancient agricultural term for the very first crop that violently breaks through the cold soil, proving to the waiting farmer that a massive, unstoppable harvest of the exact same kind is right behind it. The boy in Zarephath was a temporary rescue. The Shunammite's son was a localized victory. Lazarus was a delayed hostage. But the man who leaves the folded cloth on the stone slab is the destruction of the hostage taker itself. The grave did not just surrender a captive on Easter morning. The grave lost its mechanism of power entirely. The pattern of escalating trespasses is finally complete. The heavy iron door that Elijah sweated to push open has been ripped completely off its hinges. But this ancient shift is not just an intellectual exercise about what happened to a carpenter 2,000 years ago. It has a profound, invasive implication for the exact reality you are waking up to today. You have to understand what it actually cost to call them back. The place to start is not in the New Testament at all. A widow's son is carried to an upper room, and a prophet stretches out his own body to pull back his breath. A mother's child lies still on a bed, and a pacing mediator wrestles the heavy grave for his heartbeat. A dead man is thrown into a violent darkness, and the dry bones of a prophet violently reject his decay. A 12-year-old girl turns cold in a noisy courtyard, and a gentle command wakes her like the morning sun. A grieving sister begs for a delayed miracle, and a 4-day stench proves that biology does not have the final word. A bound man shuffles out of a limestone cavern, and the living must tear away the linen just so he can breathe. But a savior walks into the tomb himself, and the linen collapses empty, never to be needed again. Same enemy, same victor. But here is the part I keep coming back to. The word egedo, the absolute, jarring reality that when Jesus of Nazareth walks into a room and looks at a corpse, he does not see a permanent biological end. He sees a tired fisherman sleeping on a cushion in a sinking boat. He sees a little girl taking a nap in her bed. In first century Palestine, grief is loud. Flutes wail in the afternoon air. Fabric is violently torn, and professional mourners throw dry earth onto their heads. It is on a drought-cracked road in ancient Israel, hundreds of years before a Roman cross was ever built. The terrifying, crushing finality that we spend our entire human lives running from the thing that takes our parents, our children, and eventually, us. He treats like a temporary disruption. The grave is not a destination. It is a waiting room. If you are in a season where death feels suffocatingly heavy, whether you are standing beside a hospital bed, staring at a headstone, or just lying awake feeling the fragile, temporary nature of your own body, this is where you have to look. You do not have to rely on the exhausting, temporary rescues of the Old Testament. You do not have to settle for the delayed resuscitation of Lazarus. The man who holds the keys to death has already shattered the lock from the inside. Your timeline does not end in the dirt. And may the God who refused to leave his children hostage in the dark walk with you through your grief and wake you up to the reality of an indestructible life. If this opens something up for you, subscribe. Leave a comment, even one word helps. Share this with someone who is staring at a heavy stone right now and needs to know what is on the other side. Pray for us as we keep digging into these texts. Read the Old Testament accounts of the dead coming back to life, and a striking pattern immediately emerges. It is never easy. It is never quick. It is a grueling, physical struggle against a heavy, unrelenting enemy. Look at the prophet Elijah in the town of Zarephath. He carries a breathless boy. He carries a breathless boy to an upper room. He lays him on a bed. He does not just speak a word from across the room. He stretches his own body over the cold, still frame of the child. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. He cries out to God in the silence. He wrestles with the sheer finality of the room. Look at Elisha, his successor. Years later in Shunem, another dead child, another terrified mother. Elisha walks into a closed room. He shuts the heavy wooden door against the wailing outside. He climbs onto the bed. He places his mouth on the boy's cold mouth, his eyes on the boy's closed eyes, his hands on the boy's rigid hands. He waits. He feels the flesh slowly grow warm beneath him. But it is not enough. He gets up. He paces the stone floor back and forth, building spiritual momentum. He climbs back up and stretches out a second time. The Elijah climbs the narrow stairs in Zarephath. He carries a limp, breathless boy. On the wooden board ahead of her lies her only son, wrapped in rough linen, smelling of myrrh and absolute finality. She has already buried her husband, in his arms. He lays him on a wooden bed. That is the first recorded resurrection in biblical history. But pay attention to the mechanics. Pay attention to the sweat. Read 1 Kings 17. Read 2 Kings 4. The Old Testament resurrections share a glaring, unavoidable pattern. They are exhausting. Death in the ancient Near East was the ultimate one-way street. Sheol was the great devourer. It did not give up its dead lightly. Elijah has to stretch his own body over the boy's cold skin. 3 separate times. He cries out. He pleads with heaven. A generation later, his successor, Elisha, faces the exact same impossible tragedy. A Shunammite woman's son lies dead in a stifling upper room. Elisha goes in. He shuts the heavy door. He prays. He mounts the bed. Mouth to mouth. Eyes to eyes. Hands to hands. The boy's flesh finally grows warm. But the struggle is not over. The prophet is drained. Elisha has to get up. He paces the stone floor of the house. Back and forth. He breathes. He gathers himself. He goes back up. He stretches himself over, the boy a second time. Only then does the boy sneeze 7 times and open his eyes. Look at the sheer effort. Look at the friction. This is not a clean medical procedure. It is a violent tug of war. The ancient prophets are fighting a literal war in... Now, she is walking out to bury her name, her security, and her future. The procession is a one-way march to a rock-hewn tomb. That room. Death is a heavy iron door, and they are pushing against it with every ounce of their human limitation. They are not commanding death. They are begging God to reverse it. They are conduits, not the source. Resurrection in the Old Testament is not a right. It is a rare, desperate concession. It shows us that Yahweh can pull someone back from the abyss. But it also shows us how tightly the abyss holds on. Breaking that grip requires extreme prophetic exertion. The prophet's own physical body must become a bridge for life, to cross back over. And even then, the victory is strictly temporary. The boy in Zarephath will grow old. The boy in Shunem will, eventually, take his final breath. The grave always reclaims its borrowed property. The pattern is established. Life can be ripped from death. But it requires intense, agonizing contact with God's anointed. But what happens if the situation is reversed? What happens when the dead body belongs to the prophet, and the living man is the one thrown into the grave? The spring sun beats down on the rocky soil of Israel. A burial detail is moving fast, carrying a lifeless man toward his final resting place. But they suddenly freeze. Dust rises on the horizon. Moabite raiders. The invading bands are armed, fast, and lethal. Panic sets in among the mourners. And then, a traveling rabbi from Nazareth steps directly into the middle of the crowd, reaches out his hand, and touches the burial wood. They cannot outrun the cavalry while carrying a heavy corpse. And they absolutely cannot leave a brother unburied to be picked apart by vultures. In the terror of the moment, they spot a tomb carved into the nearby limestone. They do not have time to check who it belongs to. They shove the heavy stone aside, hurl the dead body into the pitch-black cavern, and run for their lives. The corpse falls through the shadows. It hits the floor with a heavy thud, rolling until it strikes a pile of dry, brittle bones. The bones belong to Elisha. The prophet has been dead for at least a year, perhaps longer. The flesh is entirely gone. The lungs that once breathed life into the Shunammite boy are nothing but dust. But the moment the dead skin of the unnamed man makes contact with the marrowless bones of the prophet, the man does not just twitch. He springs to his feet. He walks out of the tomb, blinking in the harsh sunlight, entirely alive. Why does this strange, almost bizarre event exist in 2 Kings chapter 13? Most modern readers treat it like an ancient superstition, a morbid anomaly, shoved into the back half of the historical books. The tomb is not a reliquary of magic bones. It is a boundary line. It is a deliberate marker placed in the text to show that God's life-giving authority does not evaporate just because his servant's heart stops beating. The procession halts. The flutes stop playing. The dead boy sits up and begins to speak. It is a moment that shatters the absolute laws of biology. The residual power resting on Elisha was so dense, so holy, that it turned his very grave into an outpost of the living. Even the dust of a true prophet is lethal to death. But as spectacular as these Old Testament moments are, from Elijah's exhausting struggle in the upper room to Elisha's bones sparking life in the dark, they all share one devastating flaw: the boy in Zarephath, the child in Shunem, and the man thrown into the cave were only given a temporary reprieve. They were resuscitated. They returned to the exact same mortal bodies, under the exact same curse, bound for the exact same inevitable end. They all had to die twice. The Old Testament sets the baseline, showing us that death is a heavy door that can only be wed. A burial party moves frantically across the rocky, uneven terrain of ancient Israel, carrying a fresh corpse on a wooden bier. The spring air is thick with tension. Suddenly, The horizon breaks, with the silhouettes of Moabite raiders sweeping into the valley. Panic sets in immediately. There is no time for the ritual dirges. There is no time to carefully wrap the body or seal a proper resting place. Desperate to escape, the men drag their dead friend to the nearest open cavern and unceremoniously hurl his body into the shadows. They do not realize whose tomb they have invaded. Sometime earlier, the great prophet Elisha had died of a severe illness and been buried in this exact cave. But if you read the biblical text from beginning to end, this kind of impossible disruption is not an isolated event. His flesh has long since decayed in the dry heat, leaving only a silent pile of brittle bones resting on a stone shelf in the dark. The fresh corpse tumbles down into the cavern. The cold, heavy flesh strikes the ancient, dry bones of the prophet, and instantly, the dead man springs to his feet. He is alive. It is one of the most bizarre, easily overlooked fragments in the entire book of 2 Kings. There is no living prophet stretching out over a bed in a desperate struggle. There is no crying out to heaven, no frantic pacing on a stone floor, no exhausting spiritual tug-of-war. The prophet has been dead for months, but the power of God's Spirit that rested upon Elisha was so dense, so terrifyingly potent, that it did not evaporate when the prophet's lungs finally stopped working. The power remained trapped in the marrow. The bones are not magical relics. They are a saturated vessel. The Old Testament is making a definitive, unavoidable statement about the nature of God's life when it collides with human death. The power to reverse the grave does not ultimately depend on the physical exertion of a living human mediator. It depends entirely on proximity to the unexhausted holiness of God. The moment the curse of death comes into direct, physical contact with the concentrated presence of Yahweh, death simply shatters on impact. Life violently reasserts itself. But as dramatic and awe-inspiring as these Old Testament accounts are from Elijah's sweat in the upper room, a prophet stretches out over a cold body in a dusty upper room, and a widow's child breathes again. To Elisha's bones in the cave, they all share one devastating limitation, a limitation that every scholar and rabbi knew well. The boy in Zarephath grew up, grew old, and died again. The Shunammite's son eventually stopped breathing a second time. The nameless man who sprang to his feet in Elisha's tomb, we still had to return to the dust. These were temporary reprieves. They were borrowed time. And that is exactly what a first-century carpenter steps out of the desert to permanently dismantle. Because when Jesus of Nazareth finally walks into a room containing a dead body, the very vocabulary of the miracle changes. Open your English New Testament. Read the miracle accounts. You will see the word resurrected. You will see the word raised. But the Greek text is doing something entirely different. We need to look at two specific words. First, look at John chapter 11, verse 25. Jesus is standing outside a burial cave. He is talking to a grieving sister named Martha. Martha tells him that she knows her brother will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus corrects her. He says, "I am the resurrection." The word John uses for resurrection is the Greek noun anastasis. It is a compound word. Ana means up, or again, stasis means to stand. Literally, a standing up. Now look at the verbs. When Jesus actually performs the miracle, when the dead are brought back to life in the Gospels, a dead man is hastily thrown into a cavern. His body hits the dried bones of a prophet, and he immediately springs to his feet. The writers use the Greek verb egero. It appears 144 times in the New Testament. Its primary, everyday meaning has absolutely nothing to do with a morgue, a cemetery, or a tomb. It means to awaken, to rouse someone from sleep, to tell someone to get up from a chair. So look at what egero actually implies. That root word changes everything. When a human being looks at a cold, lifeless body, we see a permanent, irreversible biological state. We see an absolute end. When Jesus of Nazareth looks at a corpse, he sees a nap. The miracle is not a medical resuscitation. It is an awakening to Elijah and Elisha. Death was a heavy iron door. It required agonizing, desperate exertion to push open to Jesus. Death is a sleeping child. The power dynamic has completely inverted. Jesus does not pace the floor. He does not stretch himself out over the body. He does not beg God to intervene. He simply speaks. This is exactly why Mark uses the exact same word, egeru, in Mark chapter 4. The disciples are in a fishing boat. A violent storm is tearing the sails. The wooden hull is filling with cold water. Jesus is asleep on a cushion in the stern. The text says, the terrified disciples woke him up, egero. They woke him up. He wakes the dead up. It is the same verb. It is the exact same action. Waking a